Good morning, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. It's getting warmer outside. Isn't that good news? I know. Yeah, this is good. Yeah. You know, I have to say, I mean, we did have a bit of a cold stretch there. Um, I do have some wonderful, dear family members who were able to skip that cold stretch and be in Florida during that time. So you can pray for them. That, may the Lord have mercy on them and not give them a cold stretch to endure as well. But they're back home, so I'm thankful to have my family home. This last couple Sundays, we have been looking at the stories of Elijah. In the first story, we looked at when God stopped the rain, and he needed to teach Israel as well as its rulers about the folly of Baal worship. God, during that story, provided food and protection for Elijah with the help of some ravens. Elijah went and stayed with a widow and her son, where God provided unending flour and oil until the rain started again so they could make bread and have food. And God also raised that widow's boy back to life. Then in the next story, Elijah appeared to Obadiah and wanted to meet with King Ahab. And so there was this challenge that was set up at Mount Carmel, and Elijah invited, or somewhat commanded, King Ahab to gather the people of Israel and the prophets of Baal to meet on Mount Carmel, where they were going to have a show-off, and see who's going to answer by fire. And eventually in that story, we saw that the prophets of Baal did not win. They were doing their entire frenzy of worship for most of the day, and Baal did not answer, and it was during that time when Elijah stood up and had the altar of the Lord repaired, the sacrifice placed upon it, and God at that moment answered by fire and burnt everything up, including all of the water that was poured all over it. And it was then that Elijah called upon the people of Israel, who recognized and declared that it's God who is Lord, to grab the prophets of Baal and Asherah and brought them into the valley just below the mountain where they were at, and that's where they slaughtered them, as it was commanded to do so in Deuteronomy chapter 13. So Elijah prayed after that, and God brought the rain. 7 times Elijah prayed, and a cloud showed up. And so that's when the people of Israel saw that Yahweh was God, not Baal. King Ahab saw this as well. And so King Ahab and Elijah made their way back to the city, Jezreel, and Elijah ran in front of his chariot. In today's story, we're going to see the aftermath of that story. Last week's story on Mount Carmel, we saw this huge victory where we saw God answer with fire and Baal didn't. We saw that it was God who was Yahweh, who is really the Lord, and Baal is a lie. And Elijah saw this, and everybody else saw this, and Ahab saw this, and Elijah thought, you know what, surely, because he was running in front of the chariot, which was actually an act of being a servant in front of King Ahab, he ran back to the city with King Ahab, where Queen Jezebel would have been, and sure, he thought this was probably going to be a good thing. Maybe the monarchy would probably switch over and start worshiping God instead of Baals. And guess what happened? It's not going to happen. And so we're going to take a look at that story today, the aftermath of Mount Carmel. We're going to look at how God's people, when serving the Lord, are not immune to the effects of fear and also struggle when life has its challenges. We're going to look at how we can be demoralized, empty, and lost. But we have a God we can count on to help us, who will take us through the dark nights of our soul and lead us and guide us. How God can reaffirm our mission and calling to live for and to serve Him. We're also going to see that God has a plan far bigger than us. In this story we're going to look at today, we're going to notice that God decentralizes our importance and reminds us that He has all the details in His hands. We just need to surrender to His will, trust in His leading, and keep coming back to Him when life gets hard. So allow me to read 1 Kings chapter 19 for you this morning. Now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there, while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. He came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. "I have had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." Then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. All at once an angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." He looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank and then lay down again. The angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." So he got up and ate and drank. Strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. There he went into a cave and spent the night. And the word of the Lord came to him. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He replied, "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, tore down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He replied, "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, tore down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." The Lord said to him, "Go back the way you came and go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael king over Aram. Also anoint Jehu son of Nimshi king over Israel. And anoint Elisha son of Shaphat from Abel Meholah, to succeed as a prophet. Jehu will put to death any who escape the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death any who escape the sword of Jehu. Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal, and whose mouths have not kissed him." So Elijah went from there and found Elisha son of Shaphat. He was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen, and he himself was driving the 12th pair. Elijah went up to him and threw his cloak around him. Elisha then left his oxen and ran after Elijah. "Let me kiss my father and mother goodbye," he said. "Then I will come with you." "Go back," Elijah replied. "What have I done to you?" So Elisha left him and went back. He took the yoke of oxen and slaughtered them. He burnt the plowing equipment to cook the meat and gave it to the people, and they ate. Then he set out to follow Elijah and became his servant. This morning I want to share with you 3 points, and I want to show you a bit of a pattern in this text. The first point this morning is the prayer from verse 1 to 9a. After the powerful encounter with God burning up the sacrifice on Mount Carmel, Elijah was getting the people of Israel to round up and kill the prophets of Baal and Asherah, with Elijah running in front of King Ahab, hoping that the victory that God brought would change the hearts of the monarchy. And so we start off this particular story with a threat. Queen Jezebel heard about her prophets, heard about the failure of Baal, heard about Elijah's role in it all, and because she is a true believer, in spite of the evidence and testimony of her king, she sends a death threat to Elijah. Now, I have to say, when you want to kill someone, Usually, you send your mercenaries, your militia, your bodyguards to make sure that the task is done. What you don't do is send a messenger with a threat saying what you're going to do. That kind of lets them have a chance to escape. So it makes you wonder, what was Jezebel up to? In other words, I think Jezebel was just wanted Elijah gone, and she got her wish. Maybe she was scared that the God of Elijah would kill her if she intended to harm him, but she had already killed a whole bunch of prophets beforehand. Who knows? What we do know is that Elijah heard the threat and ran. Maybe Jezebel wanted to make sport of Elijah, to see him run off and have her army in pursuit just to make his life miserable, always looking over his shoulder. I don't know. But she was able to get rid of Elijah, and the threat did enough damage that it demoralized the infamous prophet. Notice, though, that there's no word of the Lord here. Elijah is famous for following God. He said himself that he is zealous for the Lord God Almighty. Elijah acts on his own accord here by running away. He does not seek out God's will. He simply runs. Elijah journeyed a little over 170 kilometers to Beersheba at this point, which you can take a look at the map up there. The very top you'll see Jezreel, then Jerusalem, and then a little further south is Beersheba. That's a long ways to go. When he arrived, he let his servant go, which signifies that he's done. His psychological defeat has come to its fullness, and he was possibly even going to leave the land of Israel altogether, since he was not from the land at that point. He lived further east. He was most likely questioning his call and God's plan for his life. He felt defeated. From a great victory on Mount Carmel, we see the prophet running away. What happened? What happened in him? It was during this time when he went into the desert and he sat under a broom tree. And I have a nice little picture of a broom tree there for you. And he laid underneath the broom tree and he prayed to God, and he wanted to die. This was the dark night of the soul for Elijah. He prayed the raw, unfiltered thoughts that lingered after having run from his personal defeat. God won the battle on Mount Carmel, but Elijah ran defeated. He wanted to die, and after he prayed, he fell asleep. Well, that's when an angel showed up. He told him to get up and eat. Elijah got up, saw the food and water, filled up his belly, and he went back to bed. The angel showed up again. He told Elijah to get up and eat again, but this time told him about the journey he was about to take. So he got up and ate and drank, and he was strengthened, and then he traveled 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb. And if you look on the map again, you will see that he is going to travel from Beersheba all the way down south. And if you had noticed something, Mount Horeb has another name to it. Do you know what it is? Mount Sinai, the mountain of God. You know the stories surrounding Mount Sinai? Of course you do. That's very intentional. Remember those stories right now. Elijah is hurting. And what we see here in Elijah's journey, leaving, running, and now being brought down to Mount Sinai, is we actually see a lament. This entire story is in the shape of a lament. Even the best of us here will get run down, discouraged, burnt out, threatened, and abused. So while we explore the rest of this text this morning, let us not forget that we can be honest and open with God. No matter what it is we face, no matter what it is we feel, just like Elijah and his prayer here. But for now, let us go to the next section and explore Elijah's encounter with God. And because he's going to be journeying approximately 312 kilometers south to Mount Sinai. Point number 2 this morning is the remembering, from 9b to verse 18. For Elijah to remember who God is and what he has done, God starts off with asking a question. What are you doing here? And he gives his answer about his own zeal, how the people of God rejected the covenant, broke the altars, killed off the prophets. And what he does is he turns and he focuses in on himself, that he's the only one left, and his life is now in danger. Notice how Elijah is centered on himself, his plight, his issues. When we are defeated and hurting, it is very common to focus on self. Our worldview shrinks, and all we can see is what's happening to us. I've experienced that countless times. So God does something to try to shock Elijah out of his self-focused worldview. He tells Elijah to stand on the very mountain Moses did. The mountain where Moses saw the power and fire and smoke of God, where the 10 Commandments were written on stone tablets, the historical place where God revealed himself and established his covenant with his people. This is a very special, sacred, holy place. God reveals his power to Elijah through wind, wind that shattered rocks. The earthquake that shook the foundations of the earth, the fire that can consume whatever God wishes to consume, just like on Mount Carmel with the sacrifice and the altar. But God was not in those things. While God frequently revealed himself through fire in the story of Moses, God revealed himself in the silence after the thunderous supernatural displays of power. In the silence after the storms, God whispered. Elijah, like Moses, covered his face, knowing full well what could happen to him. That is when God gave him a chance to answer differently. So he asks him again, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" But for some reason, with the weight of defeat and emotional bankruptcy, Elijah gives the exact same answer. That is where we know that Elijah really is not in a good place. But this is when we see the grace of God alive and well. He commands Elijah with the word of the Lord to go back. God doesn't give up on Elijah. In a sense, he renews the calling of Elijah by sending him on another journey with super important tasks that actually teach Elijah and us something about serving God. That we are not the center of God's plans. God's plans are vast, intricate, and involve far more detail and people than we can understand. And from verse 15 to 18, we see that Elijah is to go anoint Hazael of the Arameans, anoint Jehu over Israel, and anoint Elisha to succeed him as a prophet. And one quick point of interest here, Jehu may become king over Israel, but he would not do so after a few years after Ahab dies. Remember, Ahab is king over the northern nation of Israel. Jehu will succeed him eventually. But you will notice something in the stories that follow. Elijah doesn't anoint him, even though God commanded him to. What you're going to see later on in 2 Kings chapter 9 is that his successor, Elisha, will. But what we see here is that the decentralization of Elijah leads to a larger picture that God will root out and destroy Baal worship in the east when Hazael becomes king over the Arameans. And Jehu would purge the cult in Israel, and Elisha would continue the prophetic ministry after Elijah is gone. But all that we see happening next, after God reassures Elijah that God is going to use political might to destroy Baal worship, is the calling of his successor. The other two aspects are ignored at this point. And that's where we get into point number 3, the calling, verses 19 to 21. In this short section, we see that Elijah is led to Elisha. God must have given him details in some kind to let him know exactly where his farm was. But Elisha seems to come from a family that has some money. They have 12 yoke of oxen, and he himself is driving the 12th. Elijah throws his cloak upon the young man, and Elisha seems to understand exactly what that meant, exactly what was happening. He was being called to serve. Serving the Lord became a very important part of Elisha's ministry once he took over from Elijah. He became the understudy of this infamous prophet. And so while Elijah dismissed his previous servant that was traveling with him, he now is gaining a new one. And what happens is Elisha requests to go say goodbye properly. And what does he do? He decides to leave everything behind. He slaughtered his oxen, which would have been a lot. He burned the equipment to cook all the meat. He gave the food to his neighbors and family and everybody there that he knew in Abel Meholah, and they ate together, and he said goodbye. He left everything behind. He burnt the necessary bridges. There was nothing to return to. And then he set out with Elijah. What started as a story of despair, fear, releasing his servant and wanting to die, changed because of the whisper of God into a story where there is hope, new leadership in different kingdoms, the promise to destroy Baal worship, the renewing of a ministry and calling, and a new attendant to serve the infamous prophet. This story reminds me of our short journey through the first 5 Psalms that we studied last year. Most of those Psalms were laments. And here in this story, we see the making of a lament. Elijah cried out to God in emotional pain, wanting to die, which is the first part of a lament, is crying out to God, saying what you need to say, telling him exactly what's going on and what's wrong. Elijah at that point remembered who God was when God sent him to Mount Sinai to rethink about the story of Moses, the Israelites, and how God saved them and led them to the very promised land that Elijah was called to serve in. Same thing with the lament. After we pray and bring all of our cares and concerns to God, we are to remember who God is and what God has done. That's what happened here with Elijah. And then finally, the last part of a lament is the same thing what happened with Elijah. Elijah remembered, trusted in God, and followed his leading to a renewed ministry. And in our prayers of lament, we trust in God to lead us and to move further into the future. The title of my message today is Elijah Needs the Lord. I think we can see this clearly. And to find application in this text, let us learn what we can about when we go through hard times and trials. Let us draw close to the Lord and remember who He is and what He has done. Let us remember our Bible stories. Let us remember our personal testimonies of what God has done in our lives, kind of like those God moments that Dolores was sharing about with us earlier. How He saved us from sin and death, and how He led us through so many terrible and painful experiences in our own lives. And from last week, as we studied the encounter on Mount Carmel, we remember, like the people of Israel, that the Lord is God. There is no other. Today, we learn to trust in our God. The God who led the people of Israel out of Egypt to Mount Sinai and established a covenant with them and gave them a promise of a new home and a new land. We can remember today that in Jesus we have a new covenant, one of love and forgiveness. We can remember that God is faithful, He is holy, and keeps His promises. There are approximately 8,810 promises in the entire Bible. In the Old Testament, there are 7,706, and in the New Testament, there are 1,104. Deuteronomy chapter 28, which is a chapter of blessings and curses, has 133 promises in it, more than any other chapter in the Bible. Now, I'm going to, as the worship team comes up right now to prepare for a closing song, I want to tell you a short story. After an evening out, some parents returned home to their children, whom they had left with the babysitter. They were pleasantly surprised to find the kids asleep when they returned home. And when the sitter had been paid, just as she was walking out the door, she communicated this little detail to the parents. "Oops, I almost forgot to tell you. I promised Sammy that if he would stay in bed, you would get him a pony in the morning." God doesn't work that way. God keeps his own promises. He makes his own plans, and he cares for you himself. While God does provide in many ways, he never abdicates his responsibility to care for his people. Today you may feel the dark night of the soul. I hope you can find comfort knowing that God has your back, that he speaks to you in prayer and through his holy word. May you find his message to you, his message that he will never leave you or forsake you, that he loves you.